I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present.
The Immigration Museum is a place of the storytelling. And we have today plenty to tell. However, before we begin our storytelling, I'd like the museum staff, Sam, to talk about the housekeeping matters.
Hi, thank you very much for attending today. Welcome to the Immigration Museum and the Immigration Museum Discovery Centre. As the presenter said, I am Sam, and I'm happy to help in any way I can today. So just a few housekeeping issues. Toilets are on the other side of this wall, so we can just walk out around there. And there's a cafe at the front as well. If you wanted to visit the rest of the museum's exhibitions later on, feel free to make your way to ticketing, which is by the front.
Thank you. In 1944, my grandparents crossed the German border with their 4 daughters. Soon my grandfather was caught and sent to dig the German trenches. He had managed to escape back to Lithuania, while my grandmother was patiently waiting for him in Germany. She didn't join the others in the displaced persons camps and worked for the local farmers instead. In 1948, my grandparents did reunite through the Red Cross. As soon as my grandmother heard the news that her husband is in Lithuania, she returned there with her daughters to seek him out. What happened during the reunification meeting was not shared with their daughters. After discovering some hidden stories in the early 90s, at first I didn't relate them to the stories of others originating due to war and misplacement. It took me 20 years of researching to understand that historical and political circumstances make people the way they are in order to protect their individual and group identity. What happened when my maternal grandfather Jurgis, or George, and my grandmother Sofia saw each other after 4 years of separation? Apparently, Sofia found Jurgis in a remote village. He sat her down and explained how he had managed to escape from digging the German trenches, how he was injured on his way to Lithuania, where he lay in the forest in pain, how he was discovered by a young woman walking past to tend to her cow, and how she nursed him back to health. Jurgis admitted seeing Sofia was quite a shock to him. He had imagined the family emigrated to the West. At that stage, his new woman appeared in a doorway and showed Sofia their baby boy. Sofia asked Jurgis to leave the room and said to the woman that she has to look after 4 daughters and desperately need her husband back. The woman cried, the baby cried, and Jurgis packed his bags. I didn't know I had an uncle until the day of Jurgis's passing away at the age of 94. I am pleased to introduce the editor of my book, Professor Ron Adams, from Victoria University, who specializes in teaching doctoral students history. I met Ron and worked together on important projects during my time at Victoria University from 2000 to 2008. With his help, I was able to facilitate the exchange program between the Victoria University and Kaunas University of Technology, and in 2002, Ron had personally signed the Memorandum of Understanding in Lithuania. Also, as a Deputy Director of Europe-Australia Institute, he was instrumental in publishing Dr. Genovaite Kazokas's book, Lithuanian Artists in Australia, 1940s-1990s. He loves Lithuania and has visited it at least 3 times.
Well, thank you for that very warm and generous introduction there. I want to say it's a real absolute pleasure to be here in Melbourne at the Melbourne launch of Grazina's book, Lietuvybė Down Under. Now, as the subtitle explains, the book deals with issues faced by Australia's Lithuanian community in maintaining their Lithuanian national and cultural identity. Now, I say it's an absolute pleasure to be here for 2 reasons. The first is because, as Grazina mentioned, I've known and worked closely with Grazina now for many years. Grazina was the driving force, and she was a little bit humble at this point, but she was the driving force behind Victoria's University's remarkable partnership with both the local Lithuanian community and with institutions in Lithuania, like Kaunas University of Technology, with significant 2-way student and staff exchanges and the publication of important books like Genovaite's book on Lithuanian artists in Australia. Now, from working closely with Grazina at the university and for travelling with her around Australia, and as she mentioned, at least a couple of times to Lithuania, I've seen it firsthand, her commitment and her professional expertise as an ambassador for both the university and for the Australian Lithuanian community. I have to say too, I've benefited tremendously from being introduced to the community, both here and in Lithuania. That's the first reason. The second reason I'm delighted to be here today is because the book is a uniquely important book. It reads well. It's perceptive. It contributes to Australian Lithuanian studies in a major way. It's honest and it's fair. It doesn't try to curry favour. It avoids being judgmental, which might, I suppose, disappoint some in the community who are still fighting the old battles. And it is compassionate. As Joseph Šestokas has accurately observed, and his observation is at the front of the book, and this is a quote, it confronts and bridges a gulf of misunderstanding, indifference and suspicion left in the wake of the Cold War thaw, with a loving care and respect for her subjects and a passion for the rigour of her work. Now, from my point of view, the book is also of major conceptual and theoretical importance. Some years ago, Melbourne's renowned ethno-historian, Professor Greg Denning, remarked how he had been lured like a moth to a lamp by the problems of the boundaries and the way boundaries are made and crossed. Boundaries between disciplines, boundaries between and within institutions, boundaries of creed and colour. He went on to make the memorable admission that he thought that it is part of the human condition to be in between. Now, in her work stretching over 20 years, Grazina has traced what it has meant for Lithuanians in Australia to be in between, as a group occupying an in-between space linguistically, culturally and across generations, but also as individuals personally experiencing what it is to be neither here nor there, neither now nor then. In her honours and master's theses and in her PhD exegesis, Grazina traced out analytically what it has meant for Lithuanians in Australia to navigate this in-between space. And in the novel she wrote for her PhD, Torn, the Story of a Lithuanian Migrant, she traces out the in-between experience through the fictionalised story of one person. In her capable hands, both genres, the analytical and the fictional, bring to life the Lithuanian-Australian experience of living in between. Lietuvybė Down Under, Grazina combines the two approaches, using the questionnaires and interviews from her honours and master's research to provide an overview of the experience of her Lithuanian Australian respondents of living in this in-between space. And in the final chapter, providing selected highlights from her PhD novel that enable readers to get under the skin of the protagonist and vicariously experience for themselves what it means to be living in between. So as a publishing innovation, the book breaks new ground, and we, the readers, are beneficiaries. Now, the book represents more than the experiences of Grazina's research participants and the novel's protagonist. It also represents her. It's written from the heart. It articulates Grazina's own lived experience. I'd like to read from the prologue, which lays out the personal challenge that Grazina has faced in living in an in-between space, as she has tried to fit into Australia's Lithuanian community, as well as integrate into the mainstream. The meaning, she writes, of Lietuvybė has shifted for me, this is her speaking, has shifted for me in recent years. When I arrived in Australia in 1989, I was going to give her... They put her in the exhibit upstairs. I'll correct that. When I arrived, she writes, in Australia in 1989 and was becoming part of the Lithuanian community here, I had no doubt that the most important aspect Lietuvybė was the ability to communicate in the Lithuanian language. But I soon discovered that confining Lietuvybė to language excludes many people of Lithuanian descent, like my husband Peter, who do not have a command of the language, but passionately identify as Lithuanian. I've had to rethink, she writes, what it is that makes people like him proud of being Lithuanian. What makes him become emotional when listening to Lithuanian singing? Content when eating Lithuanian food? What drives him to place Lithuanian ornaments around the house? Plaster our car with Lithuanian stickers, even when he is not sure of the exact meaning of the words. Although belonging to a later generation of Lithuanian migrants to Australia, I have for a long time been fascinated by the post-war refugee generation's understanding of Lietuvybė. When I arrived in Australia, I knew virtually nothing about them and why they were regarded as traitors of the Soviet Union by the Soviet-era propaganda. I set myself the task of listening to the stories, not only of the surviving refugees and their struggle to preserve a pure Lithuanian identity free from foreign influence, but also of their descendants, like my husband, who may not have retained the language, and more recent arrivals who, like herself, like me, grew up in the Soviet era. What I have learned, she writes, is that each of us has our own concept, but that we also share two important characteristics in common. We all identify as Lithuanians, and we all live outside the homeland. Now, the first 5 chapters of the book are written in the voice of the objective and meticulous researcher. In the way they give voice to the many community members that Grazina interviewed for her honours thesis and her master's thesis, the chapters provide a fascinating insight into what Lietuvybė has meant to succeeding generations of Australian Lithuanians. The 6th chapter in the book is in the voice of Grazina the novelist, with excerpts from her PhD novel, Torn, the story of a Lithuanian migrant. Now, to give you a taste of the novel, let me give you an excerpt from an excerpt. It's May 1986, and the protagonist, Dinah, recently arrived from Soviet Lithuania, who has come to stay with her great-uncle Elgus on the outskirts of Melbourne, is guest of honour at a dinner Elgus has arranged to celebrate Dinah's arrival. The following night, Elgus' house was full of visitors. To celebrate Dinah's arrival, he had invited some of his Lithuanian friends for dinner. Rimvydas and his wife Ona were an elderly couple from Elgus' age. Ona, like Dinah's grandmother, had grey hair gathered into a bun. She was slender and her face was pale. She wore a white silk blouse, dark cardigan and black slacks. Dinah remembered that her grandmother never approved of women wearing pants. A lady should always be a lady, not a man, she used to say. Rimvydas was tall. He wore a dark suit and a light blue shirt with a tie. He also wore a vest underneath his unbuttoned jacket. His hair was wavy and white. The second couple, Jonas and Zosy, wore identical green jumpers and slacks. Zosy's short hair was tightly curled. They both had chestnut hair. They must be applying the colour at the same time, sharing the dye, helping each other to dye their hair, Dinah thought. Zosy gave her a bunch of white lilies. She said they were from their garden. Dinah was taken aback when she saw that the guests had also brought food, herrings, an apple cake and alcohol. In Lithuania, the host provided all the food and drinks. She commented on this to Elgus' friends. Oh, but it's good to bring what we love to eat. Elgus usually feeds us bacon and eggs. He's a single man and not a very good cook, Zosy replied, making everybody giggle. Elgus invited them to sit down and fill their glasses. Soon his guests began to sing the old Lithuanian songs. You tell us what those old Lithuanian songs are.
Stok ant akmenėlio and aš tau sesę nesakiau.
Thank you. After a few drinks, the men wiped their tears away and raised their voices louder and louder. Dinah didn't understand why they were so upset. The protagonist Dinah's discovery that there are irreconcilable differences that may never be overcome takes us back to the historian Greg Denning's observation that it is perhaps part of the human condition to be in between. Lietuvybė Down Under, maintaining Lithuanian national and cultural identity in Australia, is an important book, not only for those interested in the history and the experiences of Lithuanians in Australia, but for everyone interested in universal themes of the human condition. I'd like to conclude by just reading it's a very brief epilogue, just half a page, but it's a very fine epilogue. Dinah's disappearance into the crowd, this comes at the end of that chapter which was the excerpt from the novel. Dinah's disappearance into the crowd at the end of the Laisvės alėja, thank you, is not the end of the story. Chapter 6 has provided the fragments of the story, which is to be continued. In the prologue of the book, I signal that the extracts from my novel contained in Chapter 6 paid homage to all the stories told and yet to be told by countless members of the Lithuanian community in Australia. In that respect, it is perhaps fitting that I have provided just fragments of my story, because most of the time, perhaps all of the time, the stories we tell are always fragmented. As chapters 1 to 5 have shown, circumstances and contexts do not stand still, and the stories we tell people have to change in line with shifting circumstances and contexts. So we can never really tell more than a fragment of an evolving story. And I offer my fragment as a metaphor for the evolving story of Lietuvybė Down Under. I commend the book to you, I'd urge you to purchase your own copy. I congratulate Grazina, and on behalf of all of us, I'm sure I also thank her for the gift she has given us. Thank you.
In 1994, I have led the combined Australian-Lithuanian group to the first World Lithuanian Song and Dance Festival taking place in the independent homeland. Some of the dancers of that group have been dancing together since their childhood, are amongst us. During our concert tour around Lithuania, they sang and danced, emotionally connecting with their ancestors' land. I read from their faces that this particular visit made them determined to keep their Lithuanian identity alive.
Teito, teitela, teito, teitela, teito, teitela, teito,
Dr. Karina Smith is a senior lecturer at the College of Arts and Education at Victoria University. Her research focuses on post-colonial literature and theatre with a particular focus on the Caribbean and Canada. She is also interested in migration and diasporic communities, particularly the Caribbean and African diasporas. During my PhD studies, Karina was one of my supervisors who provided me with a greater insights on how to relate Lithuanian history to the broader diasporic communities and how to interpret historical and political events that forever changes people's lives.
Thank you very much, Grazina. I am honoured to be one of the speech makers launching Grazina's book, Lietuvybė Down Under. It is beautifully written, personal and heartfelt, yet scholarly. It explores the difficulties as well as the possibilities of leaving home, whether through circumstance or by choice, and creating a space for community in a new place. Grazina has skillfully placed her own personal narrative of emigration in dialogue with those of the people she interviewed, evoking through the themes she explores the emotions surrounding the immigration experience. I was already familiar with some of the stories in Lietuvybė Down Under, having worked closely with Grazina for a number of years on her PhD thesis, along with Associate Professor Enza Gandolfo, who's just sitting a little bit further along. I have to say that Grazina was the most dedicated PhD student I've worked with, without a doubt. But the experience of reading the interview material and the insightful commentary Grazina provides on the politics, history and culture of the Lithuanian community in Australia gave the stories greater resonance. Lietuvybė Down Under captures the importance of preserving one's culture, building community, and being able to pass the traditions on to future generations. It is also a testament to the strength of one's culture in the face of adversity, loss, and physical separation from the homeland, exploring the challenges Lithuanians have faced living in diaspora, what Grazina refers to as the in-between cultural space we call Australian Lithuanian. In my view, one of the major contributions the book makes is its discussion of the different waves of Lithuanian immigration to Australia. The post-World War II migrants and their descendants, the second wave who came in the 1970s and 80s, and a third wave in the 1990s. And their differences from other Australians, or the way they were made to feel different, and their differences from each other due to different memories of life in Lithuania. As Grazina points out in the book, maintaining Lietuvybė has not been easy. In relation to the post-World War II migrants, Grazina writes, and I'm quoting from the book, adapting to the requirements of a new country and at the same time preserving their language was bound to be a difficult balance to achieve, especially in an aggressively monolingual society like Australia. These comments point to Australia's assimilationist policies and the way in which the Lithuanian community tried to resist them. With the second and third wave, the difficulty lies in encouraging all Lithuanians to participate in community activities so that the traditions are passed on. Lietuvybė Down Under does not shy away from discussing the differences between Lithuanians, although they form one community. Grazina deals with these differences with a great deal of sensitivity and care. As she remarks in one of the later chapters, the relationship between and among different groups of Lithuanians in Australia is not a straightforward matter that can be resolved simply. The reality is more complex, experiences more differentiated, to be accommodated by simple solutions. The final chapter of Lietuvybė Down Under draws on material with which I am most familiar, Grazina's novel Torn. By reproducing sections of her novel in the final chapter, Grazina shares some of her personal story through the lives of her fictional characters Dana and Algus, an innovative and creative way to conclude this fascinating book. And I extend my biggest congratulations to you. Thank you.
I came to Australia in 1989 on a 6-week holiday, but stayed for 29 years. Staying for a personal reason, marriage, was not viewed favorably by many post-war Lithuanian migrants who have lived in Australia since the late 40s and 50s and assessed people from the Soviet Union with suspicion, associating them with different historical and political past. I must admit, knowing little about the 20th century Lithuanian history and the reasons why in 1944, just a year before the end of the German-Russian war, some 100,000 Lithuanian citizens crossed the German border to save themselves from being killed, tortured or deported to Siberia. Lithuanian history has been hidden from the Soviet citizen like me. At the age of 19, I have knitted a jumper with horizontal stripes of yellow, green and red, and turned up at my piano lesson at the Conservatorium of Music. My teacher raised her eyebrows and asked me why I was wearing such jumper, to which I replied, because there were only available colors of all I could choose from. She whispered, "I cannot teach you today because you are wearing this jumper." I took my jumper off. It was autumn 1976. After the lesson, I walked home shivering and wondering, what's wrong with my new jumper? Living in a student hostel at the time, I didn't dare to ask anyone, eventually reknitting it using different colors. I didn't know that my grandparents had an opportunity to live in the West, but my grandmother loved her husband too much to leave him behind. Also, the burden of caring for 4 children seemed too much for her. My mother recalls how she had to beg to feed her family, as her older sisters were embarrassed to stand at the doors of the strangers. She was also embarrassed to knock at the doors and just waited until someone sees a 6-year-old with the stretched hands crying. She couldn't eat the food she brought home, ashamed of herself. After the announcement that the displaced persons camps were closing, those that stayed in the camps had no choice as to go back or immigrate. They knew that the Soviet officials are waiting for them to return to their homelands in order to execute them from running away. Many emigrated to Brazil, Argentina, USA, or Australia to save themselves from the Soviet eagles, carefully watching over the steps of the traitors of the state. The reason being, in 1940, Russians occupied Lithuania, that became one of the 15 Soviet republics, building the communism. My grandfather, upon the reunification with his family, was interrogated by KGB officials because his whereabouts were exposed. Eventually, he was left alone without charge. In the eyes of the Soviet apparatchiks, he did a right thing in escaping from Germany to his Soviet homeland. Ironically, he was one of the 75,000 men forcibly taken to dig the German trenches during the German occupation of Lithuania before the Russian return at the end of the war. We may never know how many of those like my grandfather were spared from execution and how many had to die due to the war and in the aftermath. Now I know why my grandparents didn't talk about the war, nor elaborated on my tricolour jumper that represented the flag of a free Lithuania in the period of 1980 to 1940, before it fell into the Soviet hands. This is my story, and I am relieved in sharing it with you. But there are so many more stories we would never know or hear about unless they are told. During my time, I worked with Liliana at the Victorian College of the Arts, the University of Melbourne. I have realized she had a real talent. After work, she used to rush to her acting classes, spend weekends on film sets and in theaters. I have invited Liliana today to reenact real people's stories. Many stories could not fit into my new book, but the fact that they have been documented as part of my research allows them to live on. Let's hear some of the post-war Lithuanian migrant experiences on their way to Australia and in Australia.
So these are the words of some of the Lithuanian migrants to Australia. One woman made this reflection. Just imagine all those families. We were quite lucky. Our whole family was together and never got lost on the way. Hundreds from Lithuania got lost. Have you seen my mother? Have you seen my sister? Have you seen my brother? It was incredible. They never found each other because they were too hard to find. Another woman made this comment. The communists took all my family and my brother was sent straight away from high school to jail. My stepfather was taken to jail. They came into our house just like in Dr. Zhivago, and we had to sleep in a passage. Then at night time we had to open the window and to steal our own clothes because there were not enough to take with us. We had to leave everything behind. It was terrible, such a hell. Another migrant reveals, we were dreadfully homesick when we came here to Australia because nobody knew if we'd be able to go back, if anybody would be able to visit again. I think a lot of the illnesses of older people in the community is a consequence of leaving their country. Many people left their children behind, mothers and fathers, and I think it's a massive trauma. vandenelis tinaiči, stas vandenelis, ten merga le burno prose, ten merga le burno prose, o berna liščirno girde, o berna liščirno girde, voi merga la liela, voi merga la liela, oari, si tužmani, oari, si tužmani, mažas ma no pasogelis, mažas mano pasogelis, nedelta, Vibernu želi, nedelta, Vibernu želi, pasogelis tai maniakas, pasogelis tai maniakas, o merga, le visas vietas, o merga, le visas vietas, pasogeli praulosu, pasogeli praulosu, o merga, le šenovosu, o merga, le šenovosu.
Of Jasmina and Jonas Lipschitz.
Song that we sang when we eloped in a rowboat on the river.
I had the privilege to study for many years in Australia, and as part of my master's studies by research at Deakin University in Geelong, to analyze 174 questionnaire and 82 interview responses of the Australian and Lithuanian participants. Also, as part of my PhD studies, to write a novel, Torn, the story of a Lithuanian migrant, that shed more light on how the historical and political circumstances influenced people's relationships with each other and divided them into different groups, such as post-war, their descendants, and newly arrived Lithuanians. I'm sure the similar divisions exist among other Baltic neighbors of Latvia and Estonia, because we share the same history. Are there any Latvians and Estonians here? I had one excuse to come. But the history of Soviet occupation, we share the same history. The history of Soviet occupation and post-war migration to Australia, the heavy presence of 24,000 communist card holders awaiting here that pose a great threat during the post-war era and beyond in trying to put pressure on the Baltic migrants to return to the Soviet Union. Consequently, in a period of 1945 to 1966, out of 36,613 registered Baltic migrants, 33,545 became Australian citizens. But in 1974, they had to experience the de jure recognition by Australia of the incorporation of the Baltic states in the Soviet Union. This resulted in petitions, demonstrations, and lobbying for freedom, lasting 16 months before the Australian government reversed their decision and recognized illegal Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. However, the post-war Lithuanian cohort remained frightened by anyone associated with communism. As they had been living in Australia, the people in the homeland were building communism. Not surprisingly, they became suspicious of those that arrived from the Soviet-occupied homeland. Liliana will relay some accounts of the prominent Lithuanian politicians who spoke out after their homeland regained independence from the Soviet Union.
A former Soviet party member admits, anyone who achieved any prominence in this society knew that the Soviet system was rotten and corrupt. In my travels throughout the USSR, I always carried 2 suitcases, one with my clothes and personal things, and a second with gifts for the party leaders I intended to meet. The bigger the official, the bigger the gift. Surprisingly, it was the little people who kept believing in the system long after the rest of us knew that it was a giant pool of shit. Another true believer in Marxism recalls even trying to convince his father that it was a good thing they had been deported to Siberia because driving Lithuanians from their homeland would destroy bourgeois society and set the stage for building a new Soviet society in its place.
Now we'll hear a couple of stories shared by new Lithuanian arrivals on how they feel in Australia.
Feelings of uncertainty occupy the thoughts of many. One woman reflected that it is difficult to lead a double life, that is, to live in one place while thinking of another. She feels psychologically divided between Lithuania and Australia. Although she likes Australia for its endless opportunities, her homeland is and will always be closer to her heart. She could never return to Lithuania, but is also unhappy in Australia. She regrets that everything displeases her, people, culture and surroundings. She says, "I'm at the stage that I could never be happy here, nor back home." Some migrants felt nostalgic for Australia while visiting their birthplace. Thus, homesickness for some migrants works in reverse. They miss their homeland while living in Australia, and during their visits to Lithuania, miss the Australian way of life. And as a personal note, while we were looking over the words, Grazina asked me to include my own reflections that I made. I'm a daughter of migrants. My mother immigrated here from the Netherlands, and my father was born in Hastings refugee camp after the Polish family fled Nazi Germany. And I made the comment that the vast majority of my friends are also migrants. I have Chinese, Vietnamese, and there's a common experience. Grazina and I bonded through our mutual love of the arts, but there was also a common element. The migrant experience has a thread running through it. The word that I learnt in anthropology is liminal, which means not one thing, yet not another. You're in a state in between. Especially for my Chinese friends, you know, they get that, they're born here, they get that question, where are you really from? You know, sometimes even myself, my full name is Liliana Claire Bromberger, that's 24 letters, you know. Sometimes I say to the bank teller, I wish I was Jane Smith. One more section from a Lithuanian migrant who says, "I do not know where I would go next. Would I stay in Australia, return to Lithuania, or go elsewhere? There are many things that I miss, however, mostly I long for my homeland and my loved ones. It is a big question where my next home would be."
The Australian-born Lithuanian descendants are also keeping their stories alive, stories that spring from their ancestors' past. These stories reveal what being Lithuanian in Australia meant to them, as Liliana explains.
I used to ask my mother to cut bread in thinner slices. When my mother was in hospital, my father made me take a chicken thigh to school. I ate it on the way to school not to be embarrassed. I wanted to be like other kids, and the best way was to try not to be different. I always remember when I went for a promotion, a colleague of mine said, "To get a job, you have to be 3 times better than the Aussie." He was an Australian himself, and he got a job. A post-war Lithuanian descendant admits passing her love of the homeland to her students at the Lithuanian Saturday School. During one of the concerts, she asked them to describe Lithuania. "It's a fairy tale country. It's so beautiful, one cannot even imagine it." Students replied in a chorus. "I was shaken by their answers in the sense that my students had no idea of the real Lithuania," she says. "I think we paint the wrong picture and mislead them."
And now, once again, we'll hear from the descendants of the post-war generation, the lost clock, that I would like to come on stage, please, and introduce yourself properly. We know Jasmina and Jonas. Now this is the leader of the group, VCA alumni, boys student, Stepas Levickis. And close, there's filming going on and recording going on. And please introduce the rest of the group. And please raise your hands, the people that were in Lithuania in 1994.
94.
Ah.
In order of height, Audra Daiva Šimkutė, Lina Ona Skimbirovskienė Didžytė, Jasmina Lilija Rožė Sininas, Ieva Marija Provedanaitė, Aleksas Simonas Provedanis, and Jonukas Algirdukas Lipšiukas. Shall we sing?
Your voices are taking the Lithuanian community into the future. Some 25 years ago, 25 years passed since our first encounter in Lithuania. Do you remember? When we all went to Lithuania, and Dana Levitskienė, your leader, couldn't come, so I had to step in and do a warm-ups with you, and then we performed around Lithuania. Remember that? That's the point.
I remember you pinching my bum.
I never did. Sorry, this is...
My teenage crush right here.
So, some 25 years passed since our encounter in Lithuania, and they remain the true ambassadors in promoting singing, dancing, playing, and bringing up their children in the Lithuanian spirit. Their understanding of the importance of maintaining Lithuanian national and cultural identity shall never fade.
Can we have some help, please, with this song? Yeah. I want everyone to join me in clapping like this, please.
But before we part, I'd like to ask you if you have any questions or comments to make on today's gathering. Yes.
Where is the book available to buy?
Oh, here, right here. I was such in shock when I rang the publisher, Australian scholarly publisher, that agreed to publish my book. Actually, I should add this story. 10 years I was looking for a publisher. So Ron and I prepared the book, ready to go, like a child, nowhere to put it. So everywhere I wrote to many agencies and contacted many people, still no luck. And one day I rang somewhere in Dandenong, some agency there, and they said, oh, your book is academic, isn't it? I said, yes. Well, there is Australian scholarly publisher in North Melbourne, next door to Lieutenant House. In the next street, there is this agency. I've been looking around everywhere in Melbourne, swimming here and there for 10 years. And so I arranged a meeting. And I meet the editor, Nick Walker. And he looks at me and he says, well, I'm interested. Bring the book. I said, well, it's home. I was just talking because I didn't expect that someone actually would just take and publish. Yeah, next week send it in and we'll publish it. And that's how the book became alive. Anyway, and it ran out. While I was in Lithuania, they probably didn't publish many, and they ran out of books. So I asked them, can you please send it? And there are no books, and the book launch coming up, and they're still printing somewhere. So finally, on Tuesday night, we received the parcel. So I'm happy to inform you that I've got the books. Any questions, observations?
Christina, how do you feel having at this stage of your book launch, and it's the end of a long journey for you? How do you feel at the moment?
This is Paul. We work with Paul in one office. He's a manager, big manager in the external relations area, and he's so humble. He just came to my book launch. So he's a writer himself. And we often discussed in the kitchen for the last 2 years how hard it is to be published, and nothing going on with him, nothing going on with me. So we couldn't have a breakthrough. And then I was published. And suddenly Paul tells me the news that someone's interested in his work and he'll be published. So Paul Delgado is from Ireland.
No, Scotland.
Scotland? We work in the same office. How much we know about each other in the offices today, all you hear is goodbye for today. And that's all, we have no time to talk. So nice to meet you, Paul, outside work. And I have to say that talking to people like Paul, who is the writer and who struggles with writing and who has writer's blocks and he struggles with finding publishers, we're traveling the same journey and we are happy for each other when we reach the peak and we are published. And I think that's the greatest achievement in any writer's life. When you start writing, you don't think you'll be published. When I started writing in 1998, when I wrote my honors thesis, it just sat on a shelf. Then I did my master's in 2003 and just keep sitting in the libraries. And I never thought I could publish anything because of my English. I came to Australia without English, and I learned so hard to just speak. And then I went into an academic world, and now finally this journey 20 years later is over, and I am over the moon, Paul. And tell everyone in the office on Monday, I won't be in. I'll be just celebrating. The book is out, and everyone knows about it, and I'm so happy that I made it. Are there any questions before Santa arrives? Yes.
First of all, congratulations on your book, but congratulations on this presentation. It was most interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, to put the book launch together it's very important. Firstly, for me, was important is to do it at the Immigration Museum. I thought about the best place to present my book would be this place. So I didn't know anyone here. And the first person I got in contact with, it was actually Sam. And so I said I would like to present, to have my book launched. Oh, no worries, send this in and this in. And at the end, yeah, you go for it. And I couldn't believe it. It's not even 10 years later. And I already presenting the book as it came out in May, so it's been presented. But it's very important for me that people are engaged in this launch are all here today. They're all dear to me, and I would like to thank them very much. First of all is the members of the Lost Clock. It's good that you come in, Stefan, because something else is going on now. So this is for the group to share. And mind you, this morning I logged on to Facebook and it says, Stefan Slevitsky's birthday. And I'm thinking, oh, he's coming on his birthday to my book launch. So I quickly thought about a present, and I would like to give you my book as a present. So everyone could enjoy. Then I prepared something special for my dear Lithuanian friend. You know him as long as I do, nearly 20 years. Professor Ron Adams. Thank you. To Karina, thank you for a wonderful speech and for your support during the to our talented Liliana. And what's the best way to finish the launch? As with the song. The last song from the Lost Clock.